Points of introduction, my name is Bill Fernley. I'm a senior analyst at Celent, which is part of the Oliver Wyman family. We're in the Hancock Tower in downtown Boston. The company's focus is on financial services and technology. We like to say that we're in the middle. My focus is on wealth management, so that has to do with front office. That's investment, that's investment research. It can be risk. It can be compliance. I'm currently doing a lot of multi-channel marketing work, cross-sell, upsell, multi-channel deployment, those types of things. And I was in tech, and I was in the hosting space before that. Want to thank the panelists for participating tonight. And the other thing I'd like to offer as well on behalf of the panelists, what I've asked the panelists to do is to give you their opinions based on their experience. Now, if they want to give you an opinion or something that has directly to do with their companies, we're fortunate enough to have a CEO. It could be very candid. So those types of things. So what we're asking them to do is to share their experience and share their perspectives with you. And if they want to give you real-life examples of what they're doing in their actual company, we'll leave that up to them. So with that, what I'd like to do is to ask the panelists to take 2 or 3 minutes to introduce themselves, where they are, what they're doing, and how they get into this. There you go.
Sure, thank you very much. So my name is Michael Schmidt. I'm the founder and CEO of Newtonian. So we're actually the creators of one of the most popular new analytics tools that's out today called Eureka. Has anyone heard of Eureka before? All right, so a few people, a few of you have a lot of catching up to do. That's okay. You should definitely go download and try it out on some of your data if you get a chance. But we definitely early on started off making the same mistake that Chris was talking about. We were creating an ultimate tool for data scientists, but the real impact, I think, is translating the same type of technology to a broader audience. So we have a cool technology that can, for the first time, deduce the physics, how something works. And we have a lot of people in academia, people are using it to take cosmological data and explain how galaxies form. We also have people in retail and marketing and finance that are using it to understand sales drivers, what are the key components that are limiting my production or my outcomes and dependencies and all kinds of cool stuff like that. And now we're taking that same technology and leveraging it for a much wider audience, trying to create, like what Chris described was a data science for dummies, right? And I think we've been really fortunate. We had a lot of press for the technology we've had. We've been on the Science Channel, Discovery Channel, all this cool publicity, and they've sort of depicted us as creating a robot scientist, and now we're taking that to the masses. So it was a really cool time for us and an opportunity.
Hi, I'm Deb Cooper. On Monday, the keynote spoke about how he doesn't think of big data as the right name for it. He thinks of it as all the data. And I come from a similar approach. I like to start with enterprise analytics, start with a business model. So what is the reason for your company? How do you make money? What's your purpose? Then there's drivers for that business model and that support your success. And then there's activities associated with those drivers. Now, every activity just about that happens in an organization leaves a digital footprint. And so I work with those footprints to be able to develop strategy, improve execution, and measure the results afterwards for continuous learning. So I started out in database marketing, and database marketing has been doing a lot of what we talk about in big data since Sears invented the catalog of putting together customer attributes with customer history and purchases. Grew that into strategic decision support, and then starting to work with operationalizing marketing and sales integration. So I've worked with Fidelity, Liberty Mutual, a couple of money management companies, and always on the distribution side.
Great, thanks, Deb. I'm John Rogan, and I'm here from, I'm a managing director at Devonshire Investors. We do investments in all sorts of early stage technology companies, including the big data area. But the reason I'm here on this panel is actually because I was actually in many companies, but I was in the first 6 employees of 3 successful companies. The last one called Guidewire Software. Probably no one you've ever heard of, but Guidewire Software, believe it or not, I was CEO for 10 years, and we sold software to the insurance industry. And specifically, Guidewire was the #1 technology IPO of 2012. So I have a good background with insurance companies as well as the technology side and looking at big data.
Hi, I'm John Muller. I'm a computer scientist, academic training. I did mostly algorithm work early in my career. I worked for a company that did fractal image compression. But in the late 2000s, I sort of discovered data mining and just fell in love with the idea of learning from data, and I've been working in that area ever since. And I've worked in financial services for about 10 years, and I expect that's why I'm on the panel, or maybe because they know my Erdish number is 3 and they wanted that.
I'll let you keep the mic.
Oh, okay.
So for the first question is, what's the key challenge or what's the key business issue that led you to big data and to work, and the other term that a lot of folks are using, they've scratched out big data and they call it big analytics. But what were the issues that brought you there? Was it investment research, risk, compliant, marketing? What brought you to that from a business perspective?
First of all, so we don't really deal with what I would call big data in the firm that I'm in right now. But so I think the key term for me is the analytics side, and certainly, in fact, the data that we ingest is probably not big. We may actually create big data just from all the experiments and ideas that we test out. And so there's certainly a challenge there for us in trying to analyze and interpret the results of all the ideas that we test out. So that's one of the things that is a challenge for us, a very big challenge. And it'll lead into something we talk about later, which is the visualization side. So it's a challenge not only to try to analyze all this, but typically when there's a human involved at some point, someone needs to look at the results, and so that makes the visualization of these things a challenge for a number of reasons. Sometimes just creating the visualizations is computationally intensive, and then when there's so many visualizations, figuring out, doing some triage on what you really want to look at is a challenge in and unto itself.
I'd just say that what brought me here is really, I have a passion and more around vertical solutions, like very specific vertical solutions. And I think big data or the general use of data, look, Deb said it right. There's been marketing analytics tools for decades. I mean, decades. They've been analyzing these things at a certain point in a certain way. So, the addition of NoSQL databases and things like that, that's all fine and good. But that doesn't mean anything to an underwriter within an insurance company who's really trying to figure out, is this customer going to be profitable for me or is it not? That's the question they want to ask. It's a very specific question with a plethora of potential information that you can give them to give them the answer. And the only final point I'll make is they don't want to hear, oh, well, I use R and I can help you. That's not what they want to hear. They want to hear how specifically, what data you're going to use, how that's going to be calculated. And I think most big data problems or data analytics problems are that way. They're very specific.
I'll answer in two ways. One is personal, the other is what I've seen in the industry. Personally, what led me to big data was I was an application manager for marketing campaign tool and also the analytics database. And what I found was that we could not be as responsive as we needed to be to the business. Sales would ask for a new piece of information on a report. Well, we'd have to find the information, characterize it, build our ETLs, bring it into a new structure, build it into a report, and that could take months. And that was unacceptable. So the idea of a big data platform where you could do the extract, load, and then figure out the transforms as you needed them was very appealing to me. From a financial services perspective, I've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of different companies, and the pain points that I've seen for companies with large amounts of data, bigger than 100 terabytes or so, is that they have too many types of data and formats of data, too many data sources, they're not integrated, and by the way, the infrastructure to keep all of this is way too expensive.
So for me, the part that gets me really excited about this area is, we've made tremendous progress probably over the past 20 years in being able to predict really, really accurately. So we have enormously complex statistical models that do really, really well. They can model, they can fit data, they can make very accurate predictions. One area that we really have not made a lot of progress in is actually being able to describe and explain what goes into a prediction. So that's the area that gets me really excited, that there's a huge opportunity there to not only make a prediction, but also explain what it is. The second one is that most of the techniques and applications and tools we have out today are pretty hard to use. You have to have a lot of expertise to be able to leverage a lot of these new technologies. So connecting that to a broader audience is very, very exciting for me as well. And not having to have that really extremely deep domain expertise to actually use your data to have an impact or to leverage it to max effect. And as a quick example of that, did anyone do the March Madness NCAA $1 billion challenge?
Not the $1 billion challenge.
How well are you doing so far?
I think I was out after the first game.
All right, well, so were we, but we actually did a fun exercise. So we've got a bunch of really technical, somewhat nerdy engineers. So we asked that have no idea how to play basketball or what goes into any of this stuff. We said, all right, here's some of the data that we collected online, and take an afternoon and try to use Eureka, our technology, to come up with a bracket. And most of these people had no idea what a bracket was or what a seed was. But we basically had took the data, had a way of ingesting it in. They spent about $7.54 in computing power to come up with a predictive model that had, predicted what the outcome of each match would be. And they're at about 75% accuracy, most of the people there, with really minimal effort. Imagine what that would cost you in your company to do that. You have to go out and recruit a team of data scientists. They might spend a lot of time analyzing, or statisticians working on this stuff. But there's new technology out there that can rapidly change the way you can leverage data to do things that you probably couldn't do on your own, right? Especially if you have no background in basketball or anything like that. So it's a cool application and a cool area, being able to explain predictions and also make it easier for anyone to use.
The next question I had was about open source, and that was kind of interesting, the way that Chris set it up. But one of the things about financial services and insurance certainly is there's regulation, there's compliance, there's legacy systems, there's significant operational and reputational risk. I mean, if your bank gets hacked and your account gets hacked, that's a serious problem for you. That's a serious reputational problem for the bank. But the other question I wanted to ask the panelists was, what about open source? So what we did about a year ago, one of the largest banks in the world actually asked us to do some work and take a look at the 12 largest banks in the world, publicly available information, and find out what they were doing about things with knowledge management, open source, and that type of thing. And what we were surprised by was a number of the largest institutions were out there publicly talking about open source projects that they had. They were not ripping out their enterprise database systems for sure, but they were finding opportunities to use open source. Having said that, I would ask the panel for their opinions as well, because there are some that say no, no, no. There are some that say yeah, 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 and then there's a camp in the middle that says yeah, we use it for some stuff. So with that, what I wanted to ask was, from an open source perspective, what do you see for trends for use? And then what technologies are you hearing the most about? Hadoop's the pretty easy one, but what other types of open source technologies are you hearing about with what you're doing today?
All right, so I might have a bit different answer than the rest of the panel on this sort of stuff, but I'll talk a little bit about the technology we use. I think it's important to leverage really robust libraries that are well established, but like Chris was talking earlier, the real value is in the plumbing and hooking that up to real things. You spend so much time connecting the data to the algorithm. It's a huge effort. So you can't completely neglect that. But at the same time, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? So a lot of times, there's a lot of internal development we see at companies, and they waste tons and tons of time reinventing the wheel, right? So they have standard libraries, but every time they adapt it to a new problem, they have to create a whole another UI, and the user experience really, really suffers. So that's one of the areas that we're seeing. Within our company, we leverage, the most important thing for us is now that data is really, really cheap. The other thing that's cheap but high valued is the computational effort. So we use cloud computing like crazy to be able to compute and extract these patterns as we find them. But I'll pass it on for now for you guys.
Sure. So I've seen some companies who are more risk adverse. If they do traipse into open source, they want a solution that's packaged with professional services, like what Cloudera is doing, or some of the other organizations. Let's see. One thing that I find exciting in open source is more of the lightweight SQL-like platforms on top of Hadoop and other NoSQL environments. I think once those mature, it'll be a lot easier to use that for a broader breadth of analytics.
I'd just say that in general, large companies, and whether it be banking or insurance, the bigger problem is not whether they're going to use an open source tool or not, because if it's behind their firewall, as long as there's services, like Deb said, it's okay. It's more of a question of the data. They are not fans of letting their data outside at all. So you offering them a cloud service where they're going to hand you their data, you're going to calculate and hand it back, that probably won't go over very well. I can tell you, companies like Fidelity, almost any financial service or bank, you can ask them, are you allowed to use Dropbox? Dropbox is blocked. So if Dropbox is blocked, do you think and they're not even sure what's going in Dropbox, do you really think they're going to hand over all their customer data and customer records or whatever to something in the cloud? No. While open source, as long as it's something that they install internally, sure, they'll use it because it's behind their four walls. They can kind of control it as long as there's some sort of support for it.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with that. I don't see many financial institutions running much on EC2. They'd just be afraid to let it out. And I think a distinction between what Chris was saying, I think Chris was talking more about end user applications. And yeah, maybe there's a resistance to that. I've even seen resistance to open source tools like R and Python at some institutions, but I think by and large, for example, Python I think is well adopted in the financial world and heavily used and a valuable asset. R as well. In terms of open source, there's actually well, probably more than one local companies developing open source databases despite Chris's advice. SciDB is one, and I guess we should mention them since it's a discussion about big data and analytics. I think they're trying to tackle both of those things. Should I hang on?
The other question that's actually an interesting segue about what they have internally and what they'll let out, what the firms will let outside their walls and what they won't. But one of the big questions is, some of you are within companies trying to find staff. Some of you are trying to figure out how you can become the data scientist. But one of the questions for each of the panelists that we wanted to ask was, what about build versus buy? And in particular with data, because you have your proprietary data, but what types of third-party data would you be willing to buy and bring it from the outside and then bring it inside and use it within your four walls for analytics? So when you're looking at build versus buy, are you building proprietary data sets? And if you're building proprietary data sets, are you also augmenting or supplementing that with third-party data and third-party analytics?
So certainly a healthy dose of both. In all the firms I've worked at, they've bought a lot of outside data, But I think the challenge is also to have some data that other people don't have. And whether that means constructing that from your own internal sources, if you were a big consumer bank, you have a wealth of valuable information. If you are not a consumer bank, you may piece together interesting things, like you may piece together satellite images if you're a commodity trader, you might get some value in looking at satellite images of crops. So I think a healthy dose of both is the answer, is from my experience.
Yeah, I completely agree. The financial services industry is huge buyers of proprietary data sets, and they're always looking for new data sets that they could buy or use in some way, shape, or fashion. Good example is I saw an interesting one the other day, which is a play on weather data. And the context is, if you have a claim, insurance, of course, this is property and casualty insurance, specifically around homes or cars or et cetera, huge business in the US. And the claims, if you call up and say, oh, there were 40 mile per hour winds today and it bothered it damaged my roof. Well, maybe there was 40 mile per hour winds here along the Charles River, but maybe it was only 10 miles per hour in Medford. And the problem is, what the insurance company wants to know down to your house level is, did they have 40 mile per hour winds or did they have 10 mile per hour winds? And so this company is building up proprietary data sets around algorithms around triangulating that data instead of in what's standardly available now in 35 kilometer by 35 kilometer blocks, which is it's not useless, but it's not that useful for the insurance company, but to try to triangulate down to 1K by 1K. Now that gets useful because then they can really tell, did the house have damage or not have damage, et cetera. So that's an application just of new proprietary data sets, just one example that, I'm sure people in the insurance industry are interested in.
One of my favorite large data resources is actually the US Census. I love being able to attach my customer and prospect information with market information that lets me look at market share, share of wallet, and other pieces like that.
So I can speak for, we have a few of our customers that are investing heavily in third-party data sets. They have way more data from external sources than they're actually creating internally. I think they view it almost as an arms race to, it's not just the, having that data, but actually connecting it together and figuring out what's important, what's not. And I think they view us as a way of figuring out if that data source is important or not. So we see that as a very cool trend where we have this huge breadth of data and now condensing that down into the important factors. So yeah, we're seeing that all over the place. The more variables you have, the more descriptive you can be, though it's also more dangerous to be on the overfit and things like that. So you have to have a very, very robust way of actually going about it. But it's a very cool trend to see more and more descriptive data, what's going on. Everything from like weather to the price of gas to all kinds of cool stuff you wouldn't expect to be important until you actually see how it connects.
So I was on the sell side for 8 years, and there's two funny stories because the whole issue with the investment business, I think John's earlier point was, you're trying to develop the proprietary idea, but you're also trying to get an idea that's actionable. So there were two analysts that stood out, and the story is told a lot on the sell side, about one analyst who was just like the axe, as they say, on amusement parks, and would nail Six Flags every quarter. And they're like, how the heck does this person know this? What they were doing was they were hiring pilots to fly over and count how many empty parking spaces there were in their parking lots. Which, if you think about it, is pretty brilliant. Now, once that got out there, people were like, gee, satellites. And then there's all kinds of people that sell satellite data imagery. The other great story is that sometimes to get the proprietary idea, you just have to be out there, test the theory, it works, and you become a rock star. I guess it was an analyst from a bulge bracket firm, evidently, that nailed interest rates, whether the Fed would raise or lower interest rates when Alan Greenspan was Fed governor, when was chairman of the Fed. And their batting average was like 75%, competing against folks that had tons of data, people that had PhDs, people that work with Nobel Prize winners, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, someone cracked the secret. And the whole reason he knew whether Alan Greenspan was going to raise or lower rates was whether he was carrying a big satchel or a thin satchel. Because if he was going to raise rates, he knew the Congress would go nuts and he'd have to have all of his information with him. And if he wasn't going to do anything with rates or lower rates, he knew he wouldn't have to defend himself, so he didn't carry anything with him. So once that became common knowledge, Alan Greenspan never carried a satchel after that. There was always a small group behind him, and no one knew, who was carrying what. So I guess what's important, though, is that when you talk about big data or little data, especially in investments, and then also to the comment about wind, you're trying to find that proprietary but actionable idea. And the folks that figure that out, and it is an arms race, whoever figures it out either buys something or sells something and does a transaction based off of that. So the other thing, another question that we wanted to ask the panel was, what about hiring? And what about skills? So one of the challenges, and actually we heard the comment to Chris before, what about hiring and skills development? Because one of the challenges here is that the folks on the panel are in situations where they need to hire someone, but you can't call up and say, oh, I want someone with this and this, or as in Monday's panel, they referred to it as, yes, the search for the human unicorn. The person who has all 10 of these things. So when you're talking about hiring and skills, what I wanted to ask the panel was, what are the skills you look for, and then what skills do you consider outside of the traditional education element? Like if somebody's a PhD in something, check the box, that they've done it the traditional way. But do you consider non-traditional? What do you consider, good or bad? And then also, how much do you see firms developing internal talent versus hiring it externally? Thanks.
So, I like to get this a little bit to the previous question where, there's a huge scarcity for the talent to be able to analyze this stuff. Especially with all these different data sources, imagine having an expert on weather data and demographic data and being able to apply that to your business case and sort of connect the dots from different worlds. Huge, huge challenge. In fact, when we talk to a lot of our customers, we're talking to their heads of their analytics, their top data scientist guys. In fact, I just had a meeting with a gaming company, and their top data scientist told us, he's spending 50% of his time trying to recruit. So ironically, there's this huge scarcity in this sort of talent to do this sort of stuff. In terms of identifying what that sort of talent is, personally, we actually did an analysis on this for admissions into grad school. What's actually driving whether or not you get into grad school or not? Things like your demographics, how old you are, what your grades were, what your GRE scores were, what your SAT score was. And the thing that popped out, the primary driver of that is your GPA. And we started thinking about it more and more and more, and then it's your GPA is valued higher because it's 4 years of evidence, right? It's all wrapped up into one. So if if you get a great grade on one test or something like that, that could happen by sheer luck. But if you do it over 4 years, that means a lot. The same goes, I think, with data science, where there's a ton of meetups here. The more meetups you're doing, the more experience you're getting. If I'm talking to a data scientist that we want to hire, that's what I'm looking for is challenging experience over and over and over again. And that's what I would look for.
In terms of enterprise analytics, the thing I actually look for most is the domain expertise. And if it's a more junior level, the qualities that I look at are you fearless about research and being able to dive in knowing that you don't know the answer? And also, can you explain your past projects in terms of the overall objectives of the company? Since I don't have the luxury of having all my data together, it lives in all the different enterprise applications across the company. Until we pull it together with a data model. They have to be able to find it where it lives and understand the impact and what it means to the business.
I'll only comment and say one of the things the internet in general and blogging and all these things has opened up is, what do you do in your spare time? What's your passion in your spare time? And I've seen some of the best hires are people who maybe take some data that they're passionate about in their personal life. You know, it may be cycling, it may be whatever, and they aggregate vast quantities of that data and they build their own blog that has something to do with that data. And so I would say that I've seen more questions in interviews around that than anything in their job history often. Because that really shows, okay, when they're passionate about something, how do they analytically go about it? How does it come out? And so that's what I think the internet has done to interviewing.
Yeah, again, I would agree. I think putting your work out there in a website, on GitHub or something, a blog is a great idea. From my own past experience interviewing, some of the interviews that I thought were the most revealing from the job seeker side were interviews where they asked me to do some sort of small project, sort of not during the day, but maybe over the weekend or something, some analytics, go pull some data. And so I thought that was interesting and also gave different insight into what I might be able to do and not do and how I might approach things. So I thought that was a valuable approach to hiring.
Can I ask you to keep the mic because we want to talk about visualization and you've mentioned it before. So in terms of visualization, how do you use it for storytelling, and then also how do you use visualization in data exploration? Because one of the other challenges you have is to put a picture on top. A lot of people have used click-through dashboards, right? So you have a pie chart and double click, or you have a graphic that you can get more detail on. So I was curious from the visualization side, what are you seeing from the storytelling side that's most compelling and exciting? And then what are you seeing and experiencing on the data exploration side that's interesting from a visualization standpoint?
So from the storytelling side, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, but it sounds a little more like what we might see in the New York Times. So those sorts of infographics. I don't do many of those. We don't do so many of those in the analytics side of the company. We may do some of those things on the customer-facing side where someone has a little more time to actually craft such a thing because it takes a lot of customization. But certainly, anytime there's a human in the loop, visualization is a key part of things. Perhaps that's why Excel is such a widely used tool, because you can do visualizations quite easily in Excel. So visualization is a key part of the exploration, the data exploration process that we do. I think D3, I don't know if we mentioned that earlier. If we didn't, open source tools, I think D3 is being used pretty heavily. Yeah, so it's clearly a critical aspect. And I think, as I said earlier, sometimes it's hard just to because the bandwidth of the human absorbing the visualizations is sometimes a limiting factor. And that's an interesting challenge in and of itself, along with sometimes just creating the visualizations can be computationally expensive.
Yeah, I think the visualization, there's a balance of the sophistication of the visualization versus introducing visualization that people can understand, just because it's too complex. I mean, let's face facts, most of the senior managers of companies, and hopefully there's not too many here who'll criticize me for this, they came from a sales background. And no offense to everybody in sales, and keep in mind I was in sales. We're not the smartest tools in the shed. So the problem is giving us something overly complex in visualization is just harder for us to read. That's why it was always so easy, the more simplistic, oh, here's the graph. You click down, oh, let me ask you a question about that one bar, and you can click down a level or click down a level, the more simplistic ones. I did see some more interesting ones recently. There's a company that's working on, again, going back to marketing analytics, but what they're really looking at, actually, the name is Coherent Path, if you've heard of them. What they're doing is trying to look at patterns that maybe your best buyers do of retail products on the internet, and look at the patterns of why do they go through, maybe marching from a low-end product to buying a high-end product, which obviously shows margin, and then helping helping the retail company advertise things that take other customers along that same path. But they have a visualization of here's all your products, here's how the path along that curve that your customers follow. Because it may not be straightforward. It may not be, oh, I bought this one Gucci handbag, which is the low-end one, and now I'm buying the high-end Gucci handbag. It's not necessarily that path. It may be they bought this Gucci handbag, then they bought this, I don't know, all the Gucci products, but a Gucci watch. You know, I should shop there more, I guess, or my wife thinks I should. There's a path that may be there that they can show, and they had an interesting visualization of that path that was clear for people, but they made that themselves. You know, that didn't exist before. So I think there are certain application-specific visualization tools that need to be maybe a little different for their usage, but in general, I would encourage you not to get too complex with your visualizations, because again, salespeople who are often on the gurgitation end of these things can't digest it. So.
Okay, sometimes I use visualizations more for data discovery. Sometimes I don't use it as much. It just kind of changes over time. The cases where I see it used more in the organization, a couple of pieces. One is the sales team will love to be able to look at geographically their book of business cut and rated by lots of different factors, you know, that they can control so that they can play with it and really see what's going on there. And executives often like being able to have a visual tool that they can also move the levers on and see what different scenarios look like. But both of these have to have a lot more defined underlying data set than the pure raw data that the insights are built on. You know, you don't want people to get lost in the data. You want to make sure that what they find is meaningful for them.
So, you know, I think you could spend your career just looking at visualizations, doing nothing else besides that. You know, when you look at a visualization, you're really trying to deduce a trend. That's sort of the high order thing you're doing yourself. And the more time you're doing that, the less time you're actually spending leveraging whatever you found or acting on the answer or insight that you glean from that. So I think we spend way, way too much time looking at visualizations. But I think visualizations have one very key use case, and that's when you already know the answer. You know the key things, the key elements that are important. That's when visualization actually becomes useful and powerful, because then you can use visualizations to tell the story, the answer that you want to convey and things like that. So I think it serves an important communications role, but I'm very weary of using it as a discovery tool beyond sort of lay of the land sort of things, because there's so much spurious stuff in the data sets, these sort of gnarly data sets we have today, that it's really actually hard to define the right distance metrics, the right visualizations, representations, and how we plot and represent these things, that you can really be led down the wrong road if you don't have a good way of actually figuring out if these things are real or not.
So thank you for the panel for their for the answers to the formal questions. What we wanted to do is to give 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience, and then I'll pass the microphone or the baton, as the saying goes, to folks up here on the panel. Yes, sir. And actually, what I'll do is a courtesy, because sometimes I sit in the back and sometimes it's hard to hear. I'll repeat the question for the folks in the back of the room and then hand the mic. Sir.
Yeah, Deb, you had asked a question on Monday regarding metadata, and which I thought was interesting because the conversation space has been addressing static, non-structured data, which lends itself to pretty pictures and visualizations and so forth. But how do you address the fact that most of this data cannot be it's not tagged, it's not appropriately, the data sets are incorrect. And I worked in an ETL environment 2 years ago, and it was garbage in, garbage out. And it was, the data was, we were getting different file formats coming in, and we were producing file formats going out through a SQL database where ultimately our single thing coming in. Conversation space is sort of like, it's just like account number, name, geography. Great, that's fine. But how do you address this real challenge that tagging data, giving it attribute, giving it form, how do you address that in this conversation? I mean, what kind of challenges is that? Because from my perspective, you're limiting this communication and this engagement between corporations and how they exchange data, because this data is not clean. It's not, it can't be exchanged, it can't be communicated with other corporations. So from Monday, your question was going in that direction, but I don't believe the speaker answered it.
So the question is about metadata and taking unstructured data, adding the appropriate formats so that you can use it and that so that others can use it as well. And it was a follow-up actually to a question that Deb asked on Monday. So I'll give you the microphone first, and then we'll pass it to the rest of the panel.
Thank you for feeling my pain. You know, as you know, if you handle this by data dictionary, it's stale the minute you finish it. This is really one of my big hopes for big data, is being able to do more of this intuitively. But right now in the state of affairs, I see one of the big jobs of the analyst is to put structure into the data that doesn't exist. So, you know, one example might be if I understand our business model and the relationships we have with different types of organizations, if I layer that onto my data set, my insights are completely different than if I just looked at the data set by itself. You know, for example, I'm really hoping someday for metadata that travels with the data, you know, in a, you know, either an XML-like format or something like that, but I haven't seen anything like it yet that's really mature.
Sure, yeah, real quickly, like with the customers that we're seeing, they're putting in major efforts into structuring their data. And I think there's no such thing as purely unstructured data. There's always some structure there. It's just a matter of putting some upfront effort to make that institutionalized or processed and things like that. So for the most part, you know, we say, you know, we can always be able to do the best you can with the data that you have, right? The more effort you put into it, the better you can get it structured, the better you can get it, you know, whatever you need to do to massage it to fill it in, the more valuable that data set's going to be. But we always come up with the idea of we'll do the best with whatever you have, and for the most part, everyone that we've been engaging in is already actively trying to do that within their companies already, and they recognize it as a, you know, clear challenge and also opportunity to actually leverage this stuff.
I just wanted to add one thing. In terms of scale, there's so much a domain expert can have, but when the domain expert starts working across other domains, not having all of that information embedded into the data starts breaking down what they can do.
Okay, next question. I think that's a definition of a nanosecond. I said question, and very quick, sorry.
Yes, I would like to ask a question about analytics in the insurance industry. Traditionally, you know, analytics has found its way into the marketing, customer retention, cross-sell, those sorts of areas. But in insurance, traditionally the actuaries, you know, have used it for a long time in calculating loss ratios, profitability, and so on. Has there been any acceptance of the newer techniques like machine learning, newer algorithms in those areas, or is there sort of like a resistance in the sacred inner realm of the actuarial, you know, analytic sanctuary?
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else want to go first?
One great example of a company who does that well is Travelers Insurance, that they take what they know about their customers and that history and not just use that for pricing their risk, but also for developing new products. So I find that exciting.
Yeah, so we have some customers in that domain, and they're very interested in modeling sensitivities of risk and be able to optimize things like risk. A lot of use cases around understanding drivers of new products or new product offerings. So it's a hard challenge to know who to offer new products too? How do you maximize engagement with the customer, retention of the customer, and things like this? And there's a ton of data out there that can actually describe these relationships, these patterns. And the major process that we see now that's being employed are people are doing it by hand. There's a lot of manual effort. You spend a lot of time. Some companies, hire out tons and tons of expert consulting to figure these things out. They spend tons and tons of effort to find these sort of relationships for every new product, new offering. It'd be really cool if you can do that all on your own. That's what we're trying to get to.
The only comment I'll add is when people go to the insurance industry, they tend to want to focus on the underwriting side. Specifically, what I mean is pricing and that element of it. I found those people to be the most kind of retrenched, don't want to change, this is how we've done it. There are many other parts of the insurance industry that use data. Claims is a great example. And how they build, the marketing side, how they create new products that are more willing to look at different things. It's just the pricing piece, they tend to be a little more retrenched. I would say there is a difference, though, between the consumer side and the commercial side. The commercial side, especially as you get larger and larger risks, they're willing to try anything because, if you're underwriting an oil drilling platform, it's hard to say what the risks are, right? And it depends on where it is and everything else. But if you're talking about a singular person in Massachusetts of this age group or whatever, they're dyed in the wool around how they're going to do it. So. Did you have anything? Sorry.
One comment, you mentioned machine learning techniques. I can imagine, I'm not in the insurance industry, but in the financial services, I think there's a resistance to techniques that are sort of opaque, sort of a black box, a neural network. If I can't really understand, I might know the variables, but if I don't really understand something about the relationship between the variables, the input variables and the output, I might be a little resistant to using such a thing, which is why I think regression and tree-based models are still quite popular because it's easy to understand what they're telling you. They're not necessarily the best models, but interpretability. Although I know there are people doing a lot of work on making very good interpretable models. There's a woman at MIT doing very good work on that. But I think that's a consideration.
Consideration of the speakers, I'll take one more. John over here.
There was a comment made earlier about talking about Dropbox, and then someone else said nobody in finance would ever use EC2, and I don't work for Amazon, but just if someone had a cloud infrastructure, a public cloud, they had authentication, authorization, they had encryption, graphic encryption in flight, they had intrusion detection, all of the things that would be needed for security that you would put in your own data center. Why wouldn't that be acceptable? I understand I'm not using Dropbox or some off-the-wall thing, but I'm talking about an infrastructure that you manage. And the last thing I'd say about, as part of my question, is Amazon's selling a ton of stuff into finances, but it's not EC2, and no one uses EC2. What are they selling?
Yes, so I just meant, I think it was more a comment about having, it was my comment, I think it's about having your data somehow go outside where you may have less control. So I think if one could convince a firm that the data is no less safe in this environment, in this cloud computing environment, than it is in-house. And in fact, it may be as safe, but it's a matter of liability and the data. I think it's more the data and having the data go outside your domain of influence, your control. And that was the comment, that my comment.
I completely agree with John, and I think it does come down to, though honestly, it doesn't come down to a factual analysis. It really doesn't. It comes down to, you come in there and you say, well, hey, you could move it to this infrastructure, which is outside your four walls, and you could save $1 out of every 10 you spend, or $20 out of every 10 you spend. And that person on the other end of the table is trying to preserve their job. That's what it comes down to. Do they want to take the risk where people say, you made it a little cheaper? Or do they want to take the risk that oh my God, all my data went out there, and they have the same problem as who was the one big data breach recently? I can't remember, but which one was it? Yeah. So I think that's the problem. It doesn't come down to is it right or is it wrong. And then I hate to say, this whole NSA spying thing makes people even more unwilling to put it in something like Dropbox where they don't know if, the government has access to those files.
Totally agree.
Also agree. No, I'll give a little more context. So I think there's two reasons why you want to do it in the cloud, right? I mean, you have to differentiate. You can have a private cloud, on your own internal servers in-house in your warehouses. Everything works the exact same. The key value to having it in something like EC2 is it's much, much easier to connect to external third-party data sets, things like that. And it's just way, way cheaper. So if that makes sense, then you might as well do the public cloud. But if there's definitely cases where you absolutely cannot let it leave the house at all. Sometimes you're contractually obligated. You can't legally remove, connect your data outside of your own organization. In that case, just use an internal cloud, and it's almost the exact same process. But then you need to provide your own computing power and all that sort of stuff.
Just one last comment on cloud. So I've done a fair amount of work in the space, and I actually worked at Navisite in Andover for a couple of years, which some people recognize. So what's kind of interesting is a number of the data brokers or the data analysts or data providers, some of them are literally putting AWS or whatever, putting Amazon or putting Azure in their marketing brochures. But the other thing too, it's kind of an inexact science. What we find is that there are data center providers that are known for being, they're referred to as T1. So it's not to say anything about someone who's here, but there's a Telex or Equinix or Savas or some of those guys that kind of, number one, has been known for better reliability. They've done the disaster recovery, business continuance. They know about compliance, that type of thing. The other thing that a friend of mine who actually works for an enterprise software company, one of their clients went to a smaller hosting provider that went under. And it took them 3 weeks to get their data back. Excuse me? So the other thing that factors into it is if you go with a provider that has more locations, that gives you a little more protection. So if you happen to, and I totally understand the challenge of the smaller providers, because if you only have a couple of locations and something happens, you don't have the fault tolerance that somebody else does, and to do something to move data or move capacity or move infrastructure if a storm comes or something like that. So there is a guy from Citigroup who's banging the drum against Amazon, but what I would say is the other thing that freaks him out is multi-tenancy. Right, wrong, or otherwise, I'm afraid that if my data is over here and that somehow in the middle of the night my data is going to go into another cap. No, but here's the other thing. But the last thing I'll say on the cloud is part of it has to do with its huge operational risk. And you just illustrated the point. Who had the data breach? How many people said Target? That's scary. You don't want to be Target. You don't want to be in the Wall Street Journal. You don't want to be on CNN, that type of thing. So that's another challenge with the cloud providers. They're really scared to do it in some cases. They know they want to do it, but there's a lot of risk there, including career risk as well. With that, I promised the panel that we'd be done with formal comments at 8:30. I think it's 8:28. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your support.